people that came to the location originally came from Ulster, England, and or their predecessors. And so they even, some of the first 16 people that got the church organized, one of them was a rooster, and there was a rooster on the Mayflower. So I mean, this goes back quite a ways. Okay, and they had all settled in Perry County in Pennsylvania. And it seems that those 4 families, when they came to this area, bought neighboring farms. And these were located off of what we know as Tower Road to Byron. And so you have to picture, there's no Middle Creek Church, there's no cemetery. There's a road though, it's called Kendall Road now, where Wanda Reynolds lives. And these people were expecting that road to continue on down towards Byron. And so they built their houses and their buildings where they thought that road was going to come, but the road never did come there. So when you go to Byron, on the west side of the road, you'll still see there's a whole bunch, there's 4 houses or farms back there that have big long lanes back to them. And so that's how that all came about. Okay, this is a little aside too. Wanda and her husband lived in one of those houses and had that long lane. And when they moved in, it was Anderson, what was the first?
Anderson, Mary Kissick's dad.
Yeah, so everybody knows Mary Kissick. Anyway, her dad owned it. And the place was full of mice. I mean, and there was no running water. They did have electricity, though. You could talk to Wanda about that house. Okay. But anyway, so the first ones, there were 16 members that had gotten together, and they had actually traveled to Rockford, and they helped get the first press in downtown Rockford established. But to go by horse and buggy, I don't know how they did it, how they got in there and home the same day, or how they did that. But anyhow, they wanted a church closer to where they lived. And so on a Sunday morning, or Sunday afternoon in 1855, these 16 people had the first meeting and there were some people whose last name was Bull. So it was in Bull's Stone Grout School. It wasn't long after they were meeting there that they got an invitation from another Grout church farther down on Tower Road. Of course, Tower Road didn't have that name then. But there was a church there and a burial grounds on across the street. Oh, this little Grout schoolhouse where they first met, when you go down Tower from Montague, there's a dead-end road. It's now called Stub Road, but that's where the schoolhouse was. And that's where they started worship first. So they had a preaching service and the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And 2 clergy came from the Chicago Presbytery to help them to have this first meeting and start their church. And the name of the church was chosen that day too. And back in Pennsylvania where they came from, there was a church near the little, a town called Millerstown, and the church's name was the Middle Ridge Church. Well, they didn't have any ridges here. And so they did have 3 creeks. Some of you maybe would call them cricks, but I don't call them creeks. And so they were by the Middle Creek, and so That's how Middle Creek got its name, because they were by the Middle Creek. And let's see. I'm telling some of the stuff that I was going to read, you know. All right. So, so now they have organized a church, but it took a while to get enough to get their first real pastor. But so in the first year, there were people from Rockford who came out to do the preaching. And then in 1862, a pastor from back in Pennsylvania was around. And then in another one in 1862, Mr. Meredith came, and he added 45 new members. And by then, or there were 45 by then. And he was the one that performed the first marriage. Oh, and by then, though, the church is built, okay? So I got ahead there. Okay. Some of this is going to be repeating a little bit, but from a few dedicated people in a small stone school along a muddy road to a beautiful building with a sanctuary that seats 300 people and is located, I should have brought some other glasses, along a paved road. This is the growth of the Middle Creek Presbyterian Church from 1860, started in 1855, and that was from back in 1980. The first building to shelter the Middle Creek congregation was Bull's Stone School in Byron. Let's see. The weather was rainy and the roads were almost impassable, but this was this site, and I told you where that's located. But from the small congregation, received an invitation from the Congressional Society to worship in the church. No, never mind. I got that. Okay. So then, they finally got their first pastor, and that was Reverend Braddock. And there's pictures on the table over there of him and the first church and the parsonage that was built at some point too. He had come from Kentucky, and but he was against slavery, and he was the master of a women's college, and some rebels burned it down, and so he was having problems because of his beliefs. He also, at around that same time, had one son, and the son joined the Confederates and was killed in action, and he never had any more children. So anyway, it says, for reasons of health, he started for Missouri, and let's see, I can't make this. And in his own words, he wrote, under the guidance of you know what, I need purse, I have, my cell phone. I'm sorry, I really am having a struggle and I need, it's in the one zipper in the front part, a small part. Yeah. It will only take a minute, really. I think I know what I'm doing here.
We've got a magnifier pointing at it.
Okay, now I'm in business. I should have checked this out ahead of time. Okay, I'm going to start in paragraph 1. For reasons of health, he started for Missouri and a period of rest, but in his own words, and now I'm quoting him. Under the guidance of him who never mistakes and who is never at a loss for means of transport to convey his servants to their destined place, and that's the end of it, he found himself on December 8th at Chicago on board a train of the Northwestern Railroad with a ticket for Winnebago Station in Illinois. And he heard of the pastoral opening at Middle Creek through a friend, and he came to preach and was called, and later in life he commented that some of the congregation, however, because of his manner and his dress, thought him to be such a dude that how could he be a minister? And some were sure that he was a government spy. And he retired in 1907, and after 42 years, and he was in his 90s when he retired, and he died 2 years later after that. 2 years after that. Let's see. So in the summer of 1960, now this goes back a little ways, the congregation of 47 communicant members was determined to build its own house of worship. And Mr. George Osborne was a member of the Methodist Church at Westfield Corners. But he gave them, and that would be Edith Jones's father. Anyway, this Mr. Osborne gave them the land to build their church. Now, there were 4 families down the road that wanted their church, but none of them wanted to give up any land to put the church on. So this Methodist person came along and gave them the land. And then they, and later on, another, well, and at that time, Howard, no. Anyway, Jim Bridgeland lives on that corner now, and our church has bought another, so to expand the cemetery there, okay? So on May 10th, 1961, this house of worship was dedicated. And when hearts full of gratitude, with hearts full of gratitude, and free of debt. And I have someplace else that it cost them $2,100 to build it, and that included all the furnishings. Okay. In 1911, the church again introduced the idea of a remodeling. And the Sunday school rooms were added and a kitchen. It didn't have anything in the kitchen, but anyway, they no longer, when they had suppers, they didn't have to haul, no, they were hauling water, usually from their creamery. And for when they had their suppers, but they also added a room on the back. We called it the lecture room when our kids were little, we were going there. And then they built a second floor and there were 2 Sunday school rooms up there. And I mean, later on, we thought, what a fire hazard that was. You had the wooden stairway going upstairs with no alternate way of getting out of there. But nobody ever had a problem, so. And then they put in 1949, a basement was put under the church building, and this included a modern kitchen. A well was drilled. An interesting thing about that is that the well was drilled, but it's now inside of our church. I mean, there's a place where that well thing is down in there. Anyway, and this eliminated the need for the outhouses and yeah, and calling milk cans. Okay, in May of 1958, after much discussion and planning and prayer, the congregation voted to construct the new sanctuary on the site of the old building. It was a day of mixed feelings and memories and sad hearts that we were going to tear down a building that was over 100 years old. There were a lot of people that came that day to watch, and my husband was one of them, and they saved some of the beams, and the big cross at the back of the, or front of the sanctuary is now made from the beams of the old church. And there's so many things I could write or tell you, but you know. Okay, and a new steeple was constructed, and the bell, which was a gift from the Mariners Club in 1952, was restored to the steeple, and right now it's not there again because we're having troubles. The steeple was tipping, and they have had to do some bunch of work, and so they'll get it back one of these days. But and this says that it's still being used, but I know better. Reverend Braddock was there, as I said, for 42 years. It told how, I know he made 20,000 house visits, and it told how many baptisms and stuff in those 42 years, too, but I skipped over it somewhere. So the next one was Reverend H.P. Armstrong. And Art was a teenager then, and they always called him Old H.P. I mean, they never called him Reverend Armstrong. He was Old H.P. And he and his wife had attended Hart College, and then graduated, went to some other places for his, to get his, become a minister. But, and he was only, oh, and his wife was from the South, and she had all the niceties you could expect, and so it was quite a difference for her coming to an area that was just, no, I'm sorry, that was Reverend Braddock's, right, no, but but Armstrong had that same kind of problem. Anyway, his wife passed away when he was there 4 years. And aside on that, my mother lived and taught school in that area, and she was his housekeeper for a while, and he was instrumental in getting her to go to Park College, but they also had an academy, and so that would be like high school, and so she got her high school degree at Park College. She told me, I mean, she had a terrible time with homesickness. That's not. Okay, so, and then finally, we get to Pastor, oh, let's see, he had, oh, don't know where I put it. So then we got Pastor George, 12, and he was there for 30, Old HP was there for 33 years, and now George was there for 39 years. And so we're well over 100 years and only have 3 pastors. But I was looking at somebody's list like this of all the pastors, and the Methodists, they change real often, so that's okay. Anyway, George came, and he and Trudy were married in Iowa, where she was from, and then she had a rude awakening too of that old parsonage, and some of the things she would tell us about that, but they weathered it, and they had 5 kids, and we can just kind of, you know, I kind of finished the part about the church and the stages, and so after George, we did have Pastor Brenda Alexander, who came, and she met and married her husband at our church while she was there, but after 10 years, she accepted a call to White Bear Lake in Minnesota, and next was Pastor Keith Jones, and the big thing at his time was that we acquired the middle house, and then that meant also the tomb, and so Phyllis is going to tell about that. And we're just so happy now with Pastor Anita and her husband Pat, and she started out her sermon this morning singing a song that went with the 23rd Psalm, and we had the baptism of Wanda's great-grandson. He's what, 12 years old or so? How old is Austin?
14.
14? He had never been baptized, and he wanted to be baptized, and that happened at our church this morning. And she was able to start out her sermon with singing, and that's a big part of what she does for all of us. Okay, Phyllis. Oh, yeah, yeah. I don't have glasses that would work for this. Yeah. There we go.
Mildred was bringing her hat and said I needed mine.
I was going to ask you where your hat was.
The hat goes back to about 1900. So, and the Pelotot jacket is Civil War period. So, the tomb, which I assume most of you have seen, but it's the tomb of Joseph Medill McCormick. And I'm reading this from the Biographical Directory of the United States Congress. He was the husband of Ruth Hannah McCormick, a representative and a senator from Illinois, born in Chicago in 1877. Attended preparatory school at Groton, Massachusetts, graduated from Yale University in 1900, engaged in newspaper work as reporter, publisher, and owner of the Chicago Daily Tribune, and later purchased an interest in the Cleveland Leader and Cleveland News. War correspondent in the Philippine Islands in 1901. Vice chairman of the National Campaign Committee of the Progressive Republican Movement. Elected to the State House of Representatives. Elected as Republican to the 65th Congress. Elected in the United States Senate. And served from 1918 to 1919 until his death, unsuccessful candidate for renomination in 1924. Chairman of the Committee on Expenditures in the Department of Labor, Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Department of Congress, and then he died in February of 1925. So that tells who he was. He was a Presbyterian. When he died, his funeral was at a Presbyterian church in Chicago. But that's true. His wife decided she wanted to, they owned the McCormick Farms, they owned land out here, and they wanted the burial out here. He was first buried in Chicago, and then in 1925, and then was moved out here in 1927. It's about 50 yards from Montague Road in a path leading to a brass door. It is difficult to read the name because it's been vandalized sometimes. The tomb is the last resting place of Joseph Medill McCormick, an Illinois journalist. His tomb lies in the center of 4 acres of pines and dense underbrush. Well, no longer is the dense underbrush. He was the son of Robert Sanderson McCormick, and the tomb is built of big bolt. The inside is granite from the states of Vermont and east. The big boulders on the outside that makes the pit came from Wisconsin. And they came down the river and were unloaded in Byron and then brought by horses up to the site. Mildred's husband, Art, and then Don Smith, who recently is deceased also, remember as young boys standing there watching this happen. So, at the funeral, they wanted to have just a simple funeral out in the rough woods and the dense trees and underbrush. But the funeral may have been simple, but there was a train of load of 1,500 people came out of Chicago for the funeral. And then they had a dinner down at the McCormick Dairy Farm there by Byron on Route 2. There is a book of Ruth Hannah McCormick that she's a great-granddaughter, and that's over there. And if you have other questions, we'll talk about it later.
Well, it's about time for our break. It's 4:15 already, so let's go downstairs and try to take about 10 minutes and come right back, because the Presbyterian Church here wants to get in their history. And that's what the main thing that we're going to